Paris, the City of Light, a name that conjures images of elegant boulevards, the Eiffel Tower piercing the sky, and centuries of art, revolution, and culture. But long before it became the romantic capital we know today, Paris was something much simpler, a cluster of settlements on an island in the Seine, shaped by conquest, faith, and the constant flow of the river itself. In this video, I use modern AI tools to bring historic paintings, engravings, and maps to life, allowing us to shift perspective, change camera angles, and move through scenes in ways their original artists never could. We're going to walk through Paris as it was, from Roman outpost to medieval fortress, from revolutionary battleground to modern metropolis, and see how each era left its mark on the streets that still exist today. And if you stay until the end, we'll compare some of these historic locations to how they appear in the present day, revealing what time has preserved and what it has swept away. Our story begins not with Paris, but with a Celtic tribe called the Parisii. Around 250 BC, they settled on what is now the Ile de la Cité, a natural island fortress in the middle of the Seine River. The river provided protection, fish, and a vital trade route connecting the interior of Gaul to the wider world. For these early inhabitants, the island was strategic, defensible, and central. They built wooden structures, traded with neighbouring tribes, and established a settlement that would endure far beyond their time. They couldn't have known that this small island would one day become the heart of an empire, a kingdom, and a republic. Then came the Romans. In 52 BC, Julius Caesar's legions conquered Gaul during a brutal campaign that reshaped the ancient world. The Parisii settlement was absorbed into the expanding Roman Empire, and the Romans renamed it Lutetia. They did what Romans did best. They built. Not on the cramped island, but on the left bank, across the river, where the land was flat and easier to develop, according to their precise standards. This reconstruction shows what Roman Lutetia might have looked like in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. You can see the forum at the centre of civic life, where citizens gathered for commerce and political discourse. There's the amphitheatre where crowds gathered for entertainment, sometimes brutal, always spectacle. The public baths where Romans socialised, conducted business, and maintained the elaborate cleanliness rituals that defined their civilization. And there's the aqueduct that brought fresh water from distant springs, an engineering marvel that sustained the growing population. The streets were laid out in the characteristic Roman grid, organised and efficient, a stark contrast to the organic Celtic settlement patterns. For a time, Lutetia was just another provincial town in a vast empire, unremarkable except for its position along the Seine. The population may have reached 10,000 at its peak, substantial for the era but nothing compared to Rome itself. But Rome's grip on Gaul was not eternal. By the 3rd century, Germanic tribes began raiding from the north and east, probing the weakening frontiers of an empire stretched too thin. The residents of Lutetia, vulnerable on the open left bank, retreated to the Ile de la Cité. The island became a fortress once again, its bridges fortified, its walls rebuilt with stone salvaged from abandoned Roman buildings. The Roman city on the left bank was gradually abandoned, its amphitheatre left to crumble, its baths to fill with debris. And the settlement took on a new name, Paris, after the tribe that had first lived here centuries before. As Rome fell, a new force shaped Paris, Christianity. In the 5th century, a young woman named Geneviève became the city's spiritual protector. According to legend, when Attila the Hun threatened to sack Paris in 451, Geneviève convinced the people to stay and pray rather than flee in panic. Attila's army turned away without attacking, and whether by miracle or strategic calculation, Geneviève became the patron saint of Paris, a symbol of faith in the face of fear. Christianity didn't just save Paris, it transformed it. Churches began to rise across the city, built atop pagan temples and Roman ruins. By the 6th century, Paris had become the seat of the Merovingian kings, the first dynasty to rule a unified Frankish kingdom. King Clovis III made Paris his capital around 508 AD, and suddenly this river town was no longer peripheral. It was now a capital, a place where kings were crowned and buried, where power and faith intertwined in elaborate ceremonies that merged Germanic warrior culture with Roman Christian tradition. The early medieval period was tumultuous. Viking raiders sailed up the Seine in the 9th century, besieging Paris multiple times. The most famous siege came in 885-886, when thousands of Viking warriors in hundreds of longships surrounded the city, demanding tribute and passage upriver. For months, a small garrison of defenders held the bridges against overwhelming odds, led by Count Odo, who would later become King of France. The Vikings launched repeated assaults, using siege towers and battering rams, but the Persians held firm. The city's defenders, protected by their island fortress and newly reinforced walls, managed to hold out. These attacks taught Paris a crucial lesson. Survival depended on strong defences and strategic position. The island that the Parisii had chosen a millennium earlier remained the key to the city's endurance. The Viking threat eventually subsided as the Northmen settled in what became Normandy, but the memory of those desperate sieges remained etched in Parisian consciousness for generations. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Paris had become one of the largest and most important cities in medieval Europe. The population swelled to over 200,000 people, making it one of the most densely packed urban centres on the continent, rivaled only by a few Italian cities and Constantinople. The narrow streets were crowded with merchants hawking goods, scholars debating philosophy, pilgrims seeking holy sites, and labourers hauling materials through a city that was bursting at its medieval walls. This reconstruction attempts to capture what Paris might have looked like from above during this period. At the centre, the Ile de la Cité remains the heart of the city, now dominated by the rising construction of Notre-Dame Cathedral. Work on Notre-Dame began in 1163 under King Louis VII and Bishop Maurice de Sully, who envisioned a cathedral that would surpass anything yet built in France. It would take nearly 2 centuries to complete, involving generations of stonemasons, sculptors, glaciers, and labourers. But even in its unfinished state, it towered over the island, a statement of divine ambition rendered in stone, its flying buttresses reaching outward like arms raised in prayer. To the right, on the right bank, you can see the medieval city expanding outward beyond its old Roman boundaries. This was the commercial heart of Paris, filled with guilds that controlled every trade from bakers to goldsmiths, markets that sold everything from grain to exotic spices, workshops where craftsmen hammered metal and stitched leather, and the bustling port along the Seine where goods from across Europe arrived by boat. Wine from Burgundy, cloth from Flanders, timber from the north, all of it flowed through Paris. The right bank was wealth, trade, and urban energy, the engine that powered the kingdom's economy. To the left, across the river, was the left bank, the intellectual and ecclesiastical quarter. Here stood the growing University of Paris, which by the 13th century had become one of the most prestigious centres of learning in Christendom. Scholars came from across Europe to study theology, philosophy, and law in the shadow of churches and monasteries that lined the hillside. They debated in Latin, slept in cramped boarding houses, and sometimes rioted when the quality of wine or bread declined. This was the Latin Quarter, so named because Latin was the language of scholarship, and it remains an intellectual centre to this day. Connecting these worlds were the bridges of Paris, vital arteries that allowed people, goods, and ideas to flow between the island, the banks, and beyond. The most important of these was the Petit Pont and the Grand Pont, precursors to the bridges that still span the Seine today. These bridges were more than crossings. They were neighbourhoods unto themselves, lined with shops and houses, some built so precariously they occasionally collapsed into the river below. Medieval Paris was a city of contrasts, grand cathedrals rising beside wooden houses, open-air markets next to cloistered monasteries, royal power beside monastic prayer. It was crowded, filthy, vibrant, and deeply alive. The streets ran with sewage, diseases spread quickly in the dense quarters, and fire was a constant threat in a city built largely of timber. Yet people thrived here, building fortunes, creating art, and laying the foundations of French culture. Street vendors called out their wares in a cacophony of voices. Apprentices learned their trades in cramped workshops. Monks copied manuscripts by candlelight. And somewhere in the tangled maze of alleys, a poet might compose verses that would outlive the very stones around them. This was Paris finding its voice, its character, its identity, as more than just another European city. On the right bank, not far from the river, stood a structure that would come to define Paris in a completely different way. The Louvre. This image shows the Louvre as it appeared in the late 14th century, not as the grand palace we know today, but as a medieval fortress. Built by King Philip II in the 1190s, the original Louvre was designed to defend Paris from English invasion during a time when the city's walls were constantly under threat, particularly during the conflicts that would become known as the 100 Years' War. At its centre stood a massive circular keep, a donjon that rose above the surrounding structures as a symbol of royal power. Surrounded by thick defensive walls and a moat fed by the Seine, this was a castle built for war, not for comfort. Guards patrolled its ramparts, weapons filled its armories, and prisoners languished in its dungeons. But as the centuries passed and the threat of invasion receded, French kings began to see the Louvre not as a fortress, but as a potential residence. By the 16th century, under King Francis I, the old medieval keep was torn down, and the Louvre began its transformation into a Renaissance palace. Francis I was a patron of the arts who invited Leonardo da Vinci to France and collected paintings and sculptures from across Europe. He wanted a palace worthy of his ambitions. Over the next 400 years, successive rulers would expand, rebuild and reshape the Louvre into the sprawling complex it is today, no longer a symbol of defence but of culture, art and the enduring power of France itself. By the late 18th century, Paris had become a powder keg. The monarchy was in debt, partly from supporting the American Revolution, partly from decades of expensive wars and lavish court life at Versailles. The people were hungry, suffering from bread shortages caused by bad harvests and economic mismanagement, and Enlightenment ideas about liberty, equality, and the rights of man were spreading through coffee houses, salons, and underground pamphlets. Philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot had questioned the divine right of kings, the power of the church, and the structure of society itself. Their ideas found eager audiences among merchants, lawyers, and artisans who resented their exclusion from political power. On July 14th, 1789, that powder keg exploded. This painting depicts the storming of the Bastille, a royal fortress and prison on the eastern edge of Paris. To the revolutionaries, the Bastille symbolised the tyranny of the old regime, a place where the king could imprison anyone without trial through lettres de cachet, sealed orders that required no justification. It was a symbol of absolute power unchecked by law or reason. On that summer morning, a crowd of Parisians, armed with whatever weapons they could find, muskets stolen from armories, pikes fashioned from farm tools, even stones from the street, marched on the Bastille demanding arms and gunpowder stored inside. The governor, Bernard-René de Launay, refused. Violence erupted. Shots were fired from the fortress walls. The crowd surged forward with cannons they had seized. By the end of the day, after hours of fighting, the fortress had fallen, its governor was dead, killed by the mob, and the prisoners inside, only 7 in total, including 4 forgers and 2 mentally ill men, were freed. The fall of the Bastille didn't just mark the beginning of the French Revolution, it marked a psychological break. The people of Paris had challenged royal authority and won. The king's soldiers had either retreated or joined the revolutionaries. There would be no going back. In the years that followed, Paris became the stage for some of the most dramatic events in modern history. The monarchy was abolished in 1792. King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette were executed by guillotine in what is now the Place de la Concorde, their deaths witnessed by thousands who packed the square. The revolutionary government, driven by radical factions like the Jacobins, launched the Reign of Terror, executing thousands in the name of protecting the revolution from internal and external enemies. This engraving shows the Place de la Révolution during the height of the Terror in 1793 and 1794. The guillotine stood at the centre, a symbol of swift and merciless justice designed to be more humane than traditional methods of execution, yet turned into an instrument of mass death. Crowds gathered to watch the executions, some cheering, others silent, as noble and commoner alike were led to the blade. Estimates suggest that over 16,000 people were officially executed during the Terror, with thousands more dying in prison without trial. For a time, it seemed as though Paris, and France, might tear itself apart in an orgy of violence and paranoia. But out of the chaos emerged a new order, and a new leader. Napoleon Bonaparte was not born in Paris. He was a Corsican outsider speaking French with a thick accent, a military officer who rose to power on the back of battlefield victories in Italy and Egypt, combined with shrewd political cunning. But once he seized control of France in 1799 through the coup of 18 Brumaire, he set about transforming Paris into the capital of an empire worthy of ancient Rome. Napoleon understood that power was not just military, it was visual, symbolic, built into the very streets people walked. He ordered the construction of monuments that celebrated French glory and his own achievements. The Arc de Triomphe, commissioned in 1806 to honour his victorious armies and modelled after Roman triumphal arches. The column in the Place Vendôme, cast from melted-down enemy cannons captured at the Battle of Austerlitz, and grand new boulevards designed to project strength and order while also making it easier to move troops quickly through the city. This painting shows Napoleon's coronation as emperor in 1804, held not in some ancient royal palace, but in Notre-Dame Cathedral. In a carefully staged ceremony, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head, a deliberate message that his authority came from his own will and achievement, not from divine right or papal blessing. He crowned his wife Josephine himself as well, making it clear who held the real power. For a decade, Paris was the centre of an empire that stretched from Spain to Poland, from the Netherlands to southern Italy. Napoleon's legal reforms, the Code Napoleon, influenced law across Europe and beyond. His military campaigns redrew the map of the continent. Paris became a magnet for artists, intellectuals, and opportunists from across Europe, all seeking fortune or fame in the imperial capital. But empires built on conquest rarely last. Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812, followed by defeats at Leipzig and finally at Waterloo in 1815, brought the empire crashing down. Napoleon was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. The monarchy was restored under Louis XVI, and Paris returned to a cautious peace. But the revolutionary spirit never really died. It erupted again in 1830, when Parisians overthrew the conservative Charles Ix in favour of the more liberal Louis Philippe in what became known as the July Revolution. And it erupted again in 1848, when revolution swept across Europe, and Parisians once more built barricades in the streets demanding liberty, demanding change, demanding that the promises of 1789 be kept. Each uprising left its mark, each generation fighting for what they believed Paris and France should become. By the mid-19th century, Paris was bursting at its seams. Medieval streets, unchanged for centuries, were narrow, winding, and clogged with people, animals, and waste. Disease spread quickly in the crowded quarters, particularly cholera, which killed thousands in epidemics in 1832 and 1849, and revolutionaries could easily build barricades in the tangled alleyways, turning entire neighbourhoods into fortified zones beyond government control. Napoleon III, nephew of the first Napoleon, came to power in 1852 with a vision to modernise Paris, to make it clean, efficient and beautiful, and not coincidentally harder to barricade and easier to control. He appointed Georges-Eugène Haussmann, a civil servant with an iron will and limitless ambition, to redesign the city. What followed was one of the most dramatic urban transformations in history. Between 1853 and 1870, Haussmann tore down entire neighbourhoods, displacing thousands of working-class Parisians who were pushed to the outer edges of the city. In their place, he built wide, tree-lined boulevards that cut straight through the old city like knives. He standardised the height and style of buildings, creating the uniform Haussmannian facades we recognise today. Cream-coloured stone, wrought-iron balconies, mansard roofs. He installed a modern sewer system that ran beneath the boulevards, gas lighting that illuminated the streets at night, and public parks like the Bois de Boulogne and Butte Chaumont, where Parisians could escape the urban density. This photograph from the 1860s shows one of Haussmann's new boulevards under construction. You can see the scale of the project. Entire blocks are raised, rubble piled high, new buildings rising in identical rows, the old Paris vanishing beneath the modern. Critics accused Haussmann of destroying the soul of the city, of prioritising control over character, of erasing centuries of history in favour of sterile uniformity. And they weren't entirely wrong. The wide boulevards were beautiful, but they also allowed troops and artillery to move quickly through the city, making future uprisings far more difficult. The barricades of 1848 would be impossible to recreate on these broad avenues. But love it or hate it, Haussmann's Paris endured. The boulevards he built, the Boulevard Saint-Germain, the Avenue de l'Opéra, the Boulevard Haussmann itself, are still the arteries of the city today. They define how we experience Paris, how we navigate it, what we photograph when we visit. By the late 19th century, Paris had entered what the French call the Belle Époque, the beautiful era. It was a time of peace, prosperity, and cultural flourishing between the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Cafes filled with artists and writers like Monet, Renoir, Hemingway, and Picasso. Cabarets like the Moulin Rouge drew crowds looking for entertainment and escape. And new technologies, electric lights, motorcars, cinema, photography, were transforming daily life at a pace never before experienced. And then, in 1889, for the Universal Exposition celebrating the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution, Paris unveiled something the world had never seen before, the Eiffel Tower. This photograph shows the tower under construction in 1888, its iron lattice rising impossibly high above the city. Designed by engineer Gustave Eiffel, the tower was meant to be temporary, a showcase of French engineering to be dismantled after the exposition ended. Many Parisians hated it. A group of artists and intellectuals, including Guy de Maupassant and Alexandre Dumas, signed a petition calling it an eyesore, a metal monstrosity that ruined the city's skyline. Some called it a disgrace to French taste and aesthetics, but the public loved it. Millions visited during the exposition, climbing its stairs — there were no elevators initially — to see Paris spread out below them in a way no one had seen before, as if viewing the city from the heavens. The tower was never torn down. Instead, it became the symbol of Paris itself, appearing on postcards, posters, and eventually in countless photographs and films. It proved that even the most controversial additions to a city can, with time, become beloved, even essential to a city's identity. The 20th century brought Paris face to face with unprecedented horror. In World War I, the city was spared direct assault, but it became a city of mourning as millions of French soldiers died in the trenches just miles to the east. The front line came close enough that Parisians could sometimes hear the distant rumble of artillery, the city filled with wounded soldiers, refugees, and women working in factories to support the war effort. The Belle Époque was over, its optimism shattered by industrial warfare. Then came World War II. In June 1940, German forces entered Paris after defeating French armies in a lightning campaign that shocked the world. There was no battle for Paris, no siege. The French government declared Paris an open city to avoid its destruction, surrendering it intact to spare it the fate of Warsaw. For 4 years, swastika flags hung from the Arc de Triomphe and the Eiffel Tower. Nazi officers strolled the Champs-Élysées, dined in fine restaurants, and posed for photographs in front of monuments built to celebrate French glory. Parisians lived under occupation, under curfew, under constant surveillance and fear. This photograph shows German troops marching past the Arc de Triomphe in 1940, a sight that would have been unimaginable just months before. For those who lived through it, the occupation was a wound that never fully healed, a humiliation that complicated French identity for generations. But Paris did not stay silent. Resistance networks formed in the shadows, printing underground newspapers, sabotaging German operations and sheltering those hunted by the regime. Jews, communists, escaped prisoners, downed Allied pilots. The risks were enormous. Captured resistors were tortured and executed. But thousands took those risks anyway, keeping alive the spirit of defiance that had always defined Paris. And when liberation came in August 1944, it was Parisians themselves who rose up first, building barricades in the streets, echoes of 1789, 1830, 1848, and fighting German troops with whatever weapons they could find until Allied forces arrived. This image shows the liberation of Paris, with crowds filling the streets, tears of joy mixing with relief, as General Charles de Gaulle walked down the Champs-Élysées in triumph. The city had survived. Modern Paris is a city of layers. Walk down any street and you're walking through history. The medieval layout of the Marais, the revolutionary squares where guillotines once stood, Haussmann's boulevards that reshaped the city, the scars and triumphs of 2 world wars, all of it is still here, still visible if you know where to look. The Louvre is no longer a fortress, but the world's most visited museum, housing treasures from across human history. Notre-Dame, though scarred by the devastating fire of April 2019, is being painstakingly rebuilt, scheduled to reopen its doors. The Eiffel Tower still stands, now lit up every night, a beacon visible for miles, twinkling on the hour as millions of phones capture its glow. Paris has always been more than a city. It's been an idea, of civilization, of revolution, of beauty, of resilience. And even now, as it faces new challenges, climate change, social division, questions about identity and immigration, the pressures of modern life, it remains a place where history is not locked away in museums but lived in every day. Standing here, looking back at these moments, it's hard not to feel how much this city has endured, how much it has shaped the world. From a Celtic island to a Roman town, from a medieval capital to a revolutionary battleground, from an occupied city to a modern metropolis, Paris has been reborn again and again, always carrying the weight of its past into the future. If there's another city, another moment in time, or a historic scene you'd like to see brought back to life, let me know in the comments. I'd love to keep building this journey into the past with you. Thank you so much for watching.